Okay, so good evening all, to those in the room and to the millions watching at home via YouTube. My name's Councillor Callum Taylor, and I'm chairing tonight's meeting of the Economy in Place Policy and Scrutiny Committee. This is a commissioned slot, so it focuses on one item, which is the digital Respark scheme, and how the implementation of that has panned out. So that's the main agenda item, but we do have normal business to work through in forms of declarations of interest. Do any members have any? We have two. Councillor Kilbane.
I live in a digital Respark zone, so obviously there's financial implications for me as to what we're discussing. But I noticed that the report says that all wards are affected, so I'm assuming that all wards have some form of digital Resparking in them.
Yeah, for those that got municipalities, then yes, it will be, but that's only
Yeah, for those that have only got minister badges, then yes, they will affect all wards in that way, but not Respark per se.
Okay, cool. Well, I think we can proceed anyway, given the nature of this particular matter. It's sort of everywhere in a way. Councillor Dave Taylor.
Yeah, I think it's a personal interest in item 3, really, as I too live in a Respark area and have been subject to some of the problems occasioned by the new system.
Okay, thank you. We have a hand from Councillor Degorn, who's not a committee member, but he's here helping to present the main item.
As you say, I'm not actually making decisions, but in the interest of transparency, as of this week, I live in a Respark area as well.
Thank you, Councillor Degorn. Councillor Daubney.
Again, in the interest of total transparency, I should perhaps declare that I too have a Minster badge, but I don't live in the Respark area.
Thank you. Any further? No? Okay. Thanks all for that. That brings me to the next item, which is public participation. Pleased to say that this evening we've got 3 speakers. One is doing so remotely and 2 are with us in the room tonight. The first is Joe Coles, who's here to speak about the digital Respark item. If you just come to the front, Joe, make yourself comfortable. We have a 3-minute rule, but I'm not going to be brutal about it.
I just wanted to share some of my experiences and frustrations as a resident in a new digital parking zone. To start, I would just say change is normally great if it makes things better, but these digital parking permits have made things more complicated and less convenient. They cause unnecessary stress, anxiety and pressure on the relatives and carers of elderly and vulnerable residents. In my own household, the main ongoing problem with the new system is that it is extremely hard to deal with these permits when you're not at home. We've had particular problems for workmen, for those helping with childcare or visitors who arrive early. If you're at work and have someone arriving at your house, it is not always possible to stop what you're doing, ask them what their registration number is and sort out their parking permit. Before, you could just leave a paper permit for them to complete themselves. The second issue that I want to raise is the technology itself. I've got real concerns about the system for the elderly and anyone with a disability. It is very difficult to navigate, even if you are tech savvy. It is particularly difficult to use on a phone, and it must be adding significant pressure onto carers and family members of those residents. Initially, the system wasn't properly aligned with banking security, which meant that payments didn't go through at all or got refused. And while this problem now seems to have been resolved, it is still not possible to bulk buy permits as it used to be to last a long period of time. Just at the weekend, I tried to buy 50, but once again, was only able to buy 20 as 50 is not a possible amount to purchase. The problem here is that when the technology itself is not actually very good or user-friendly, it is very difficult as a resident to support it. Better road testing with residents in advance might have helped with that, as might have communication with residents about the system and what the benefits were going to be. But unfortunately, The problem was that the previous system worked perfectly well. It was simple and easy for everyone in the community to use. What was the rationale for changing the system? What are the benefits of the new system, and how much has it cost council taxpayers like me to bring this in? As a resident, I feel resigned to using this system and engaging with it, but it has not improved with time and it remains stressful. Just last week, I was at work and my mum came to our house to help with some childcare with our son. She had to call me to activate a permit for her in the middle of the afternoon when I was in a meeting. The final point I want to make is that there should be a proper apology from the decision makers at the council to those who are working in parking services who have been at the receiving end of all the complaints from residents about this new system. It is awful that they must have had to deal with hundreds of people calling up to complain about people being unable to access this system, which was implemented poorly, and it feels to me unnecessarily. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much for that. All really helpful contributions, and we'll absolutely factor them into the discussions tonight.
Thanks.
Thank you for your time. So our next speaker is the one doing so remotely, and their name is Andrew Mortimer. Andrew, can you hear us?
I can, Chairman. Can you hear me?
Absolutely. Fire away whenever you're most comfortable.
Okay, thanks very much. I just wanted to start with, I live in the Badger Hill zone, so kind of my experiences from the arrangements up here, and I know the digital side of things works the same across the city, but the zone we have here at Badger Hill is slightly different to experience people might have elsewhere. So I just wanted to flag that up to start with. So I've got two issues I wanted to raise. One kind of links in a little bit with what the previous speakers said about visitors, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And the second thing relates to the ability for residents to actually check whether vehicles do have a valid permit or not. So I think the first thing I'd like to say is I welcome the proposals for the resident permit checker. I think this is really important, and actually it ought to have been in place from day one of the digital permits, because I think the current inability for residents to find out if a vehicle part has a valid permit really undermines trust in the system. People, certainly that I've spoken to locally, my neighbours, think, oh, the system's not working because there's a car parked there and there's no permit on it. They've no idea whether it should be parked there or not. They've no idea whether to report it or not. So the sooner this system's in place, the better. And I would certainly encourage the council to make every effort to try and get it sorted out as soon as we can. My main comment, however, relates to the issue of visitor permits in particular for the offline system users. And the first thing I'll say is I'm currently on screen. I've got the council's website open on the page about applying for visitor parking permits. And if you read the information that's on screen, you can only get online visitor parking permits. There is no guidance whatsoever anywhere for how to go ahead and get visitor parking permits if you don't have access to online systems. And now clearly people who don't have access to online systems aren't going to read this, but they might ask a neighbour or a friend, what do I have to do? And actually the guidance is pretty poor at the moment. So first thing is, please, can you make sure the guidance on the website to tell people how to get visitor permits works for both people with access to online systems and those who don't. The main issue I've had from talking to some of my neighbours is, and particularly some of the older members of the community, is that actually they don't use the online systems. They know how they can register their vehicle and go through all the systems that we have to do that. But it becomes really problematic if they've got visitors. If you don't have ready access to online systems, getting a permit for a visitor, particularly if it's somebody who arrives at short notice that you're not expecting, it's all but impossible. So I think we need to look again at how the visitor side of the system works for those people without the online system. And certainly some of my neighbours tell me they actually discourage visitors now because it's just too complicated for them. So rather than trying to engage with the system, they just tell people not to bother coming while the rules are in place. And because that mainly affects some of the more elderly in the community, that's actually not what the council ought to be doing. We ought not to be kind of, in effect, enforcing isolation of some of our elderly residents because they can't work out or visitors can come and see them.
Mr. Mortimer, are you able to wrap up, please? But we're already quite over 3 minutes.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the key thing. Basically, we need to try and make the system for online, offline visitor permits work better than it can at the moment. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Andrew. Very much appreciate your contribution and your time this evening. If you have a question for the speaker, Dave Taylor, that's absolutely fine. Mr. Mortimer, are you still there? Is it, has he just?
So, can you hear me now?
Yes, Mr. Mortimer. Apologies for the confusion. We have a member who would like to ask you a question, if that's okay.
Yep, please.
Andrew, would you explain why Badger Hill zone is different to other zones?
Yeah, the whole of Badger Hill is kind of one zone. So in a lot of parts of York, you kind of get individual streets, and all the streets are quite clearly signposted as being in residents' parking zone. In Badger Hill, and I think also in Newland Park area, you've basically got signs as you enter the main zones, and then you've got a limited number of kind of repeater zones within the street. So it's often quite difficult for people to pick up on what the arrangements are in our area. It's certainly not as comprehensively signposted as some of the other residents' parking zones are.
Okay, thank you. And I know it's one of the more recent ones that was instituted. Yeah. Thanks for that.
Thank you again, Mr. Mortimer. No one's looking like they want to ask a question, so we will let you continue with your evening, Mr. Mortimer, unless, of course, you want to watch the rest of the meeting. Thanks again for your time.
Thank you.
Which now brings us to our third and final speaker who is in the room. This is Flick Williams, who wants to speak about an item they would like adding to our work plan as a committee. Flick, fire away.
Good evening, Chair and elected members. I've come this evening to ask if you will add an item to your work plan. I'm sure you are aware of the 3-hour customer and corporate services scrutiny meeting that took place a week ago. It looked at the update to the City Centre Action Plan on mitigations to the blue badge exclusion from the foot streets. Despite the length of the meeting, the complexity of all the issues in combination meant that the surface was barely scratched. It was only at July's executive that the issue of cafe licensing was added into the mix. The disabled community feel that blue badge ban aside, outdoor dining and the way it is being licensed, contrary to government guidance, has in effect created a second tier of discrimination for disabled citizens and visitors. We are a group that has a protected characteristic in law under the public sector equality duty, and yet many of us feel we are treated by this council like just another lobby or interest group. The executive resolved to hold a consultation on cafe licensing. Having taken part in it, there are some very major problems with it. And in summary, without having yet read the actual report, because it has not been provided to participants, despite having been written and submitted, I believe the very pretext was flawed. It appears to me that the goal was to seek ways to circumvent government guidance. We sought a commitment to co-production, yet we were told the report must be written by the consultant only. I question why there were participants in the consultation who were not local people. One was from Suffolk. I question why there was a so-called site visit to the city centre to which no local disabled people were invited. Who would know the problems better than disabled people who use the city centre all the time? During the consultation, we learned that the council has already ordered temporary yellow roadwork ramps for deployment around cafe furniture. The cart before the horse once again. Why would you place an order before hearing what disabled people have to say about them? Unless, of course, you think you know better because it's what someone told you they do in Westminster. Yet in a different context, we keep hearing York isn't Bath, it isn't Chester, and no, it isn't the city of Westminster either. Chair, none of this passes the smell test. To be blunt, it stinks. It could be argued that economic interests are being prioritised to the extent that placemaking is being compromised, and an already disadvantaged group of people further discriminated against in the process. I'm aware of a guide dog user who, pre-outdoor dining, was confident moving around the city independently, but now doesn't feel confident enough to go out without her husband, negating the whole point of having a guide dog. That is the discriminatory effect. The whole situation needs some proper scrutiny and oversight, and I would urge this committee to add it to the work plan as a matter of urgency. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Flick. If I may, I have one question. I think Councillor Kilbane, did you have one as well? Is that right? Yeah, you might have two in that case. Really appreciate that contribution. Just so I and committee members can sort of get this as accurate as possible, I wondered if you could summarise the kind of report that you're asking for in one sentence. What would that sound like? And it can be a long sentence, if that helps. If you can't come up with that now, that's fine. It's not make or break at this moment, but because I think it's a really valid request.
Well, sorry, can you be a bit more? I'm not quite clear.
I might be able to help. It's a similar question. Essentially, what is it that you're asking the scrutiny committee to look at in terms of its work programme? What aspects of cafe licensing is it? So is it compliance with legislation? Is it the to scrutinise the report that's currently being produced? What precisely is it that you want the committee to do?
Yeah. Yeah, sure. I would like proper scrutiny of the report that is being provided from the consultation. And obviously that would necessarily be looked at in the light of what government guidance says.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you, Flick. James Gilchrist, this is an officer for those unaware.
So I'm the Director for Environment, Transport and Planning. Just to confirm, because it may help this discussion on a little bit, the papers for executive next Tuesday, where pavement cafes is due to be considered, have now been published, including that report. So if people want to go and look at what the report says, it is now on the website.
Okay, that is helpful. I don't think it necessarily negates this request to come to this forum. Yeah.
If you wanted to go and see what the report actually said, and Ms. Williams can also go and obviously look at that as well as being on the website.
Thank you. Cheers. All good. Well, you're welcome to stay with us tonight, or you can do whatever else of your evening. Thank you, Flick. And we will come back to that contribution in the work planning item of this agenda. Right, which then brings us to the actual main item of business, which is a report on digital Respark. Officers, you might already be familiar, but how we tend to do it, since I've been chairing, is I ask you to give a very brief summary of the paper that we all will have read, just for the benefit of anyone watching. And then we'll go into questions. I know one of you has to leave at 6:15. Yeah. Was that? Yeah. Okay. So yeah, we'll bear that in mind, and yeah, fire away. Cheers.
Evening, Chair. I'll just start off with, we had some supplementary questions from yourself, Chair, that came through after I've written the report. I received them, sorry, after I've written the report, and it was submitted. What we're probably going to do is try and cover some of those in the meeting tonight, but some of the other ones which might take a bit further work, we'll bring to a future session.
Yes, I mean, for more clarity for members, there's been a discussion outside of the meeting, which is that I don't necessarily feel like the paper we've got is in line with what was initially requested. So for those who are at the informal work planning meeting back in July, there was a discussion on whether or not this report should also include a review on how parking enforcement is operating on a wider basis. So not just focusing on digital Respark. We haven't got that additional section. And I have raised a concern about this and said that we'll have to deal with that at a future meeting, because I'd want anything we're looking at to be published online in good time so that people can actually read it. But there were questions on Respark too that aren't in this report. And I think one of them was actually touched on by the first speaker, which was around the financials of this. So if we can get anything on that tonight, that would be good. And any further information on digital Respark further to the report we've got, that would be helpful.
Sure.
Cheers.
No worries. So I'll bring, James might want to come in on some of the questions in terms of what we got from the public speakers. I think we'd fed back on the first one. I think probably for the first speaker, I think it's probably important to note that the some of the things that came out in terms of the motivations for this came through a scrutiny in 2019. So that was around permits going virtual, self-serve, and usage of ANPR. That came out of a scrutiny meeting. So there was some sort of pre-requirements around this. I think what the main driver for us, there's three elements of the new system, Chair. There's the requirement to upgrade the system, because the previous system, which was about 10 years old, well, at least 10 years old, wasn't public sector network compliant, which is an IT security compliance issue. So the first motivation in terms of going through the procurement was to buy in a system that would meet that compliance. The second issue is, prior to the introduction of the system, the interface between the customer and parking, or the parking services, the services make up the parking processes, were either through the telephone or through face-to-face. So something like 25% of the footfall for face-to-face, sort of pre-COVID, was made up of representations around parking. So there was a question as to, with the new system, there was the possibility of putting this online as per the digital strategies that have been previously supported by executive and cabinets prior to us embarking on this work when we went into the procurement a couple of years ago. And the third element is going virtual permits, so that is on top of us providing a customer interface through the website and providing a replacement system. The third one was, the decision was which permits would be virtual. So at the August 2020 exec member decision session, we took a paper to Councillor de Gorn, and there was a comprehensive list at that meeting of the permits that would be virtual in the first instance, and there were decisions made around us using the customer interface and then obviously upgrading the system. The timings of the upgrade, which was September 2021, was to cover us in terms of the PSN, or public sector network compliance. And once we'd gone, so winding back from that, we'd been through probably about a 2-year process where we'd engaged with the market. It was probably the most comprehensive procurement of an IT system that I'd been involved in, but I was involved quite to the back end. In terms of customer input into that, there was our website is designed around best practice for public sector websites, so that the interface is which had been co-designed with residents. So this was when we did the website design, probably around about 2018. That was with resident input. So it's all designed around that. And it's probably worth highlighting that the system that you see online is a combination of the council website and the Taranto parking system. So the purpose of the the customer journey on the website takes you from the council website into the Taranto system, and where you do the transactions. But the customer journey piece is consistent with central government best practice and consistent with the rest of the rollout on our website in terms of the presentation. So accessibility and things like that. When we went live with the system in September 2021, it was clear that there were some issues in terms of the presentation of the customer journey, which was in our hands because it formed part of the website. So the system and the website had all been tested, but some of the things that we knew may present themselves as problems were things like issues with the data sets. So we were working with data sets which were about 10 years old. So to give you a flavour of what that is the records against each customer in the system, which was the previous Imperial system, the links to things like permits, but we had to, although we did some cleansing work, we had to largely go with what data came across with the new system and cleanse as customers came into the system. So there were probably 2 or 3 issues. So the data side of it, some issues with the customer journey, and some of the letters we sent to residents, which based on our feedback at the beginning, caused some confusion in terms of how the system would be used. And I think one of the main issues that we met was that residents weren't sure when to engage with the system. So it was about when your permits expired and not on that first day it went live in that September. And I think those 3 issues particularly led to an increase in calls at the beginning, and it compromised our ability in terms of our services to respond to residents who needed, who we would through the system intended to need support through the phone teams. So people who don't access IT equipment, or people who have difficulties getting online or things like that. We'd put specific processes in the customer centre that would allow somebody to be assigned as an offline customer. But some of the call volumes at the beginning, which were reportedly around about 2,500 calls higher than we would get in a normal month, contributed to our inability to respond to those residents. And I think it's probably the first opportunity we've had publicly to apologise to those residents who experienced difficulties in the first instance. I think so what I'll do, Chair, is I'll move on to the table, if that's okay, and then we'll take questions after that. So I've covered a little bit about the customer usability here, and I want to just give feedback to the scrutiny committee that a considerable amount of work went on, particularly in that first month, to improve the customer journey. And I think one of the things that we realised was the sort of keenness for users of the system to get straight through to the parking system rather than follow the customer journey processes we put on the website. And so we made some of those improvements immediately in the first 2 to 3 months. We've got this still as it's like yellow, but it's as amber technically because we've got a new version of the system. And one of the benefits of the new version of the system, which we'll get in the spring next year, will be the ability to put more guidance actually in the Taranto system itself. So from a user's perspective, you can probably tell when you switch from our website to the new system. But one of the limitations was the amount of guidance we could put on the actual Taranto pages. So that'll improve with the new version. And when we put that live, that will also resolve some other issues around usability. The second one, which I covered, was around the customer renewal letter. The third one, which we've got green here, is around the payment issues, which I think at least one of the public speakers, apologies, I've forgotten off the top of my head, mentioned issues with the payment system. And I think what's probably worth pointing out is part of the difficulty of the implementation of a system like this is the complexity of the complexity of resident parking itself and the complexity of implementing something around parking in any city. I think what we'd found some challenges in terms of integrating with our corporate payment system. I think one of the public speakers have mentioned the number of permits that you were able to order at one time, which we've worked hard with the corporate payment engine provider to work through how we could do that in a more efficient way and how we could make that customer experience better. What I would say is we have had recently some issues around browsers and operating systems that people use on MacBooks, PCs, etc. This isn't new to parking systems, for example. I've worked around implementations of web-based systems in councils for over 20 years, and there is one thing you can't control is how somebody accesses the system, and that is something that we sort of heavily relied on our suppliers to resolve, and we'd insisted through the procurement that they were as accessible as possible. But we have experienced some more recent issues around, I think it's Google Chrome on iOS operating system or something like that. I can't remember off the top of my head, but we are working through those issues and we hope to resolve in the near future. Customers unable to register their addresses. There were some issues. So going through to one of my earlier points about data, one of the things that we tried hard to resolve in the first instance was to make sure that we had all the addresses on the system, but matching addresses to addresses is quite a difficult thing from a technical perspective. So we cleansed it as well as we could, but we've continued to do that cleansing operation to make sure that the customer data within the systems are correct and fit for purpose. So that again, that's resolved, but that's something that we had to resolve over the course of 12 months, because as residents came onto the system, we would get new residents who would identify issues potentially with their addresses, and those were some of the things. It's particularly where you've got names of people in the system where we don't have the addresses is slightly more easy to handle. It's where we've got variants of names. So for example, if somebody had entered in the system as Dave or David, it might not make a match in the system and might cause some problems. In terms of, talked about the timings of renewals, but happy to take any questions if we have any. In terms of customers not able to, I think we talked about that again. I think, Graham, is there on F, this is customers not able to renew the digital permits. This was in the first instance about the fact that the permits hadn't expired, wasn't it? But were there any other issues related to that?
Let's see. No, I think that's pretty much about it. I mean, there were some complexities when the permits were being brought into the system and then still renewed as well. There's been a number of issues around that. We work with TSL on, who's the supplier of our system called Taranto, but that's been working through system by system, whether it's based on the types of permits, i.e. guest houses or residentials, but we should be there now with that.
Thanks, Graham. We'll probably get into more discussion, I assume, about virtual permits as we go through the questions, Chair. So I won't speak much more about those. I'll take the questions and then feedback as you ask questions, if that's okay. I think one of the things I think it was Andrew Mortimer who raised was about the resident permit checker. So that was something that we'd asked for in the original specification, which the provider didn't have an out-the-box solution for, but we'd agreed that it would be implemented at a point when they did have a solution for that. And that is, we have actually got a version of that which will roll out with the next version. And this, for avoidance of doubt, is the ability for the resident to put the registration plate into a portal and it to feed back to us. Yes, sorry.
Thanks for letting me interrupt you, and I wasn't planning on. I've just got a question on that, and I'm asking this quite naively as a councillor that's still fairly new to the game, I'd like to think. The amount of things that we try and get done sometimes, and we have to wait for ages because it's got to be done just right. and a million things need checking before those things can happen. You've just said now that we asked for this checker before we launched, and the company said that we don't have it right now, but we will do in the future. My initial reaction is, why on earth just didn't we wait until that was ready then? What was the rush?
The implementation was we had to implement for PSN compliance. So there was a marker. I think it was, for your benefit, Chair, I think it was something like March 22 that we would be assessed again for our public sector network compliance. And at that point, it meant that we had to have a system in by that point. We obviously didn't have a resident checker before. So the view was that we would roll out back office stuff, then roll out front end stuff, which is what we did. And then through the specification, insist we had this tool. Now, you did ask, if I may, you did ask for an update on the resident hotline. So what I was going to ask Graham to do is just to describe how that works, if that's okay, because that's a solution we had previous to having this resident checker, and which is obviously still in operation.
Yeah, it is. I'll cover the permit checker as well, Callum, as well. So at the moment, what we've had for many years is a parking hotline, 0800 number. Essentially, it's out there. How that works is simply it calls into a national call centre. There's a person that answers that call, and they take sort of generic information down. It's the customer isn't asked for their name, so anonymity is quite key around that. And it's details like, where the car is, what the car is, registration number, that kind of stuff. And that's what we have in place at the moment. And that's only there if residents, anyone for that matter, want to report on a legally parked vehicle. That then basically links into the parking enforcement team, who then send an officer out, usually within policy about 45 minutes where we can, depends where it is across the whole of York boundary, including the villages as well. They will go out and assess that. And then if they find the vehicle there and deem that it requires a penalty charge notice, PCN as we call it, then it will be issued on it accordingly. With the digital rollout, it was clear that obviously there was a lot of functionality in that we wanted to see. I think we all wanted to see that. And based on things like the DVLA lookup, for example, where you can check if a vehicle is tapped or not, we requested once we had this system implemented that would look and call from many people as well to develop this permit checker. That is now in development, and that will, as Dave Wright was saying, will be rolled out in the 2.13 upgrade on 2.11, so the 2.13 upgrade, where residents will be able to enter in a VRM, as we call it, a reg number, into the system. That will then feed back to the resident saying, yes, that vehicle does have a permit, or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, then it'll be fed back to the parking enforcement team accordingly. So that meets the requirements of GDPR and any data protection issues in there as well.
Okay, I'll just rush through the other two just because Graham's got to go at 15:15, Chair. So the other two issues were of customer password updating not working, which we resolved with the supplier, and we've got an issue with some details. So when a resident's putting the vehicle registration into the system, it wasn't matching what was on the DVLA register. So again, that's a process where we signpost the resident to DVLA. It wasn't something that we could resolve because it was obviously looking at the DVLA database. I think on probably as a final thing, I just wanted to balance out some of the representations which we absolutely hear and take on board, that we have had some compliments for the system too. I haven't got them here. I'm happy to present them to the chair at some point, but we do have compliments. We've got a significant amount of transactions going through the system relative to the number of sort of representations we've had, which has diminished over time as people have got on the system, got more used to it. And then probably the last one is, I think one of the scrutiny meetings took a paper from customer services on customer call times and performance and things like that. I wasn't at that meeting, but I'm not going to update too much on customer services because obviously that was a subject of a scrutiny meeting and we're not from customer service, so I'm happy to represent their views. But my understanding is that call volumes are at a normal level now, and part of the issue they now experience is about the number of staff they have. in the team able to field calls?
Depends what we mean by normal. I think I had a 2-hour wait a few weeks ago. But are you finished with your contributions?
Unless you've got any immediate questions for me, Chair, I'm finished.
I've got a fair few. I'll let other members make a start. So I've got Dave Taylor and then Councillor.
Sorry, Chair, can I just discharge Graham before?
Of course.
Yeah.
And so if you've got any questions, I mean, obviously feeding through Dave, and I can come back to you and the other committees, offline if that comes into it, then there's any public decisions, public comments, anything like anyway. But yeah, my apologies.
No, it's fine. But I would ask if you can find the time to watch the rest of the meeting when you're back on shift, as it were, because I think we're going to cover a lot of ground on this item.
Yeah, that's fine.
Councillor, before you go, Graham,
Yeah, please, yeah.
Councillor Cobain, is this for Graham?
It is, Chair.
Yeah.
Okay, right.
Chair,
Sorry.
if I can just put on the record my thanks to Graham Titchener for the work he's done over the last year and a half. It's been an absolute nightmare to deal with, both from a councillor and a staff and a resident position. But Graham has always been timely in his responses and honest in his responses, and we greatly appreciate what you've done. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for that, Councillor Cobain. Graham, have a good evening. Take care. Councillor Dave Taylor.
While Graham's still in the room, I'll echo those words. I'd like to begin by saying I always thought it was a good idea to move towards digital permits, and I still think that was a good idea. In theory, it should cut administration, and that's recognised in the first line of paragraph 10. And it should permit the council to service the growing number of areas in the city which are demanding action on tourist or student or commuter parking problems. And I also recognise that it's a very complex problem that this has been to replace the system. I used to work in the Department of IT, doing that job of replacing major IT systems. So I can truly sympathise with the staff involved in all of this. But the system is terribly clunky. Even as an ex-IT professional, I found it difficult to work. My first question is about the procurement process, which is mentioned in paragraph 17 and 18, and you've talked a little bit about that, Dave. But were any visits made to other local authorities which are using this Toronto system?
Yes, we did some engagement with other authorities that use this system. So it's used in the majority of London boroughs who have variations of systems like Respark. It's also used for things like the congestion zone in London as well. So it's used in many other authorities.
You mentioned Sheffield and Manchester.
Yeah, so there's other authorities where it's used, and I think we did some specific case studies as well as consulted with their user group forum that they had for the system. As you'll know, with any IT system, the way you implement it to a certain extent dictates how successful it is. And I think the scale of the transition from a back office system to a customer focused self-serve system was perhaps something with hindsight that
are we saying that none of those other authorities have done that?
Oh no, they've all done it, but I think they've probably had it for a lot longer than we have had. So they started off, lots of London started off with very discrete bits of Respark like we've got, and most of them have now gone to much bigger zones than the whole area covered. So I think they were ahead of us, and I think we've implemented it, the self-serve aspect and that rollout at the same time. And I think that possibly, with hindsight, we could have done more with our residents to support them in that self-serve change. I think that is something we'd probably, with hindsight, reflect on and go, actually, how do we better support residents? And I think that sort of touches on the fact that there will always be an element of our residents who need support to access these systems. And I think the principle, and it was right there at the very beginning, even before procurement, was that would always need to be there. So that the principle was we shift as much online as we can, and the resource that gives us allows us to support those residents who need it more. Whether we got that right or whether we should have engaged with them more, I think is the challenge, which I think is a fair one and a lesson for us to learn and take away.
I think we might conclude that we didn't have enough support in the early days for the system. We'll see how that goes. I mean, I personally, I think there's some problems that were actually very easy and should have been resolved by more information, and others which are much more complex. But I personally had difficulties with issue E, the timing of the renewals. And I didn't think there was sufficient guidance provided online about this. Specifically, that you can't renew on the day that the permit expires. You have to wait until the day after the permit expires. And I was there at just 5 minutes after midnight trying to renew my permit. It's very frustrating, but I do concede that this problem has now been resolved for future. I wanted to know whether the other authorities with whom you consulted, whether any of them telegraphed this issue G, that the residents cannot check that a car is parked in the street has a permit, because I would have thought that that would have come out of the experience of residents in other authorities.
It was certainly something we're aware of, and it's for people, I mean, it's out there, it's in the public domain. Other authorities tried to solve it themselves and ran into data protection issues by trying to build their own in-house checkers. So one of the things we were very acutely aware of when we entered into this procurement process was that the council weren't going to try and do this through the back door and end up with a data leak and a compensation claim and an issue with the Information Commissioner's office. We were adamant that this was going to be solved by the provider and not budged. So yes, we were aware of it. Okay. It is, I mean, what I don't think we'd perhaps appreciated is how much residents did that themselves in York compared to other areas. I think it's other authorities haven't needed it in quite the same way York needs it, which, you know.
Are you suggesting that York is full of curtain switches?
No, not at all. But all I'm saying is that it didn't particularly come up through the consultation with those other authorities, but it was something we were aware wasn't in there. We were aware it had been a problem when other authorities had tried to do it on their own website, which is why we said it needed to be an off-the-shelf product by someone who was going to protect the authority from that data leak challenge.
Okay, well, I concede that you have a scheme in trying to fix that problem as well. My next question, if I may, Chair, concerns carers. I know this was raised by Jo Coles when she spoke. Whether professional or family members, carers might very well need to visit and park daily or even more frequently than once a day. This is clearly generating a lot of support and complaint calls. How can the system be simplified to meet the needs? How can the system be simplified to meet the needs of elderly and disabled people's carers?
So for professional carers, my understanding is it is a paper permit. Yeah. So it's a paper permit for those professional carers. Where I think we probably need to review, and I confess I don't know, I need to go away and do the work, is where those family members provide care. We need to look at how that permit system or how they gain access to park. The only thing I would say is that the family member needing to park is probably less of an issue in terms of not knowing the reg number of the person who's going to turn up. It still might be an issue, but where you've got a care company providing care, it's obviously much more challenging to know what reg number will turn up, who will be sent out on that shift, etc. Yeah. So that's why the professional carers definitely is a paper permit. I've heard the speakers tonight talk about family carers and caring, and I will take that away and do some looking at that.
Okay, thank you, because I think that's a real bugbear for a lot of people. Finally, there is a business on the main road in Fishergate which has been unable to renew its parking permit. Seemingly, this is due to an inability to select business as a customer type. Has this problem affected other businesses in York, or is it a one-off for this particular business? And if it is affecting other businesses, when will this issue be resolved?
I think
I'm not sure. So what you're basically saying is they can't choose business permit.
I'll bring in Councillor Degon because I know he's getting copied in on a load of correspondence about this. But as I understand, the business cannot renew that, oh, hell. Sorry, the business cannot renew its permit because when it attempts to select the customer type as business, it can't do that. And there's been a lot of correspondence between this particular business and your department about what to do, and it's not been resolved. So what my question was, because I don't really want to spend this meeting talking about one particular individual's problems or one business's problems, but is it a problem which is affecting other businesses, or is it just this one business?
I'm not aware of it as a trend because it's not in the report. What I'm surmising now, but I suspect it's marked on the database as a residential address, which is why it's precluding a business. If there's not a business registered there, we've not picked it up. But if you send the details through to Dave and Graham, I'm sure they'll have a.
Okay, I think Andrew DeGaulle might have already done that, but I can certainly do so myself, and I can confirm that address on the main road has been a business for at least 20 something years, all the time I've been living in York. Right, that's me then, Chair. I'll let somebody else have a stab at it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Dave Taylor. If I may, I have one question for this moment, which is to Councillor DeGaulle. You are the accountable person in the room, it has to be said. I remember in one of your reports to full council, going back a number of months now, I think you described some of the issues in what I would describe as quite a sort of euphemistic tone, as some of the issues with Respark's implementation as being teething problems. And I wondered if after maybe the 4 or 5 months that have passed since then, if you've had time to reflect on that and how you think, things are progressing with this. What are your reflections on the implementation? What should have happened differently? Because we've had a lot from officers, and I think we get that a little bit too much, as great as they are. It'd be nice to hear from the politicians a bit more from time to time.
Thank you. Well, as you've heard from officers, there is the benefit of hindsight to recognise that there's some things that we didn't quite get right. And as you allude to, certainly in the early days, obviously in the first month, there was, a bit of a car crash in terms of the actual level of demand on the support systems, which in the following months, officers have addressed. And I think certainly my experience has been that there were a number of issues which I hadn't anticipated being of concern. This interface between payments and registration, I think, seems to be something which, I personally would have thought we should have been able to resolve by now. But, that certainly is clear commitment that we will address that. The interface, certainly in the last, over the last few months, combination of individual residents emailing me, and as you've heard, the significant support we've had from Graham Titchener as the sort of person closest to the coalface of dealing with the IT systems. We have tried to work through those and get the system to work for the benefit of the customers. I mean, ultimately, my objective is very much to have a system which has the maximum efficiency and user-friendly functionality for those who are confident with IT systems, but equally for sufficient support for, as we've heard, carers, those who are occasional users, probably not even got a permit for themselves, but have regular visitors, to adapt our service to be able to cater for their needs as well as for those who are online and using the IT system. So that clearly is my objective, and I'm doing my best to work with officers to try and resolve the outstanding issues, so that the service that residents get is as user friendly as possible, but also cost effective from the point of view of the demands on the council with all the different financial pressures that we face.
Thanks, councillor Zagon. I think you used the word efficiency in your answer, and it's a term I'm interested in. So I have another question for you, which is, do you think we're in a more efficient place now than what we were prior to this implementation? And if the answer to that is no, how long do you think it will be before we get to a place where we can say we are now so much more efficient than what we used to be, therefore it was all worth it? Could you say a month, 6 months, a year?
Well, I think the proof of the pudding will be very much in this upgrade, which we promised early next year. Certainly, as you've heard, we did ask for the permit checker from the outset. That was one of the issues that I anticipated would be of concern with going to a virtual permit system. From memory, I also at the time asked about provision for direct debit, like phasing payments rather than a one-off, and I believe that is something else that I would hope that's something else that we could include in an upgrade. And I'm conscious that having dealt with not just in my ward but across the city, the concerns of residents about the impact of commuter parking in their streets. The majority of residents who have concerns about that, the most significant barrier is the financial cost of the permit. And recognising that, I think the opportunity to pay monthly rather than coming around like your car tax and your MOT and everything, it's in one big dollop would make it a little bit less painful to have to pay for the service that comes with being in a residence parking area.
Thank you for that response, Councillor Zagon. I will give way to Councillor Pearson shortly. I just have a couple more questions, which I'll do in one go. Firstly is we had an apology from officers to those who struggled with the implementation for whatever reason. That's lovely, but I always think it should be the politicians fronting that. So firstly, my question is, will you apologise to the residents who've had a nightmare with this new system? And more positively on top of that, if we're looking at recommendations, would you be open to actually having residents in some sort of troubleshooting retrospective testing group that should have happened some time ago?
Certainly, I'm happy to make that apology for the experience. Personally, just on the basis of the emails that have come my way, I fully appreciate the difficulty that some people have experienced. And obviously, when that has happened, I've done my best, as has people like Graham, to resolve those. And certainly, I'm sure that officers will confirm that when they have come my way, they've been passed on to try and get a learning from that experience to improve the system for everybody. So whenever a particular issue has arisen, I've sought to get that resolved. And as you will appreciate with IT systems, sometimes some things are easier to resolve than others. Just as an example, one reference there was about the data set, which a resident living on a street will tell you the names of sort of bungalows or whatever that haven't got a number, but they're not necessarily, if they're not on the postal address, then that can create problems for the being able to actually apply for permit. And likewise, the other one which came up was particularly for people who are getting visitors permits and haven't got a car themselves, they maybe not appreciate the difference between an O and a 0 or a 1 and an I. You know, if you put the wrong information into the online system, then when the enforcement officer checks, it could well be a simple mistake like that, that means they get a PCN, which we can then have to try and resolve. But, you know, those sorts of things, you know, I would hope with a national system, you know, the operators would welcome the invitation to put that sort of confusion in, so that there's a setup if you've got a 0 or naught, an I or a 1, that either is acceptable in terms of enforcement, rather than giving a ticket for somebody because they've got the wrong digit.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor de Gorn. I mean, I do think it's probably fair to say that certain technical issues are perhaps harder to foresee, but there are quite, in my view, basic issues that have come about as a result of this implementation that should have been spotted, and which will have been spotted with timely involvement from residents, particularly those who aren't, for whatever reason, online. And we say this a lot for different council services. Digital first can sometimes feel like digital only at this council, and that's got to change. But I'll give way. Councillor Pearson, thanks for your patience as well.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, officers, for your report. I'm just intrigued to know you're saying that this system basically had to go live in March. I'm just wondering. So, firstly, I guess to start with, you said that this has been sort of known since 2015, and that it was first sort of budgeted for in 2018. How come we got so close to the wire? I appreciate there's been a pandemic, which might be one of the reasons, but how come we got so close to the wire before sort of being able to properly test the system before it had to absolutely go live? And secondly to that, could we have asked for any kind of derogation to be able to prolong the legacy system for another 2, 4, 6 months until such time as we knew everything was tickety-boo?
I think in terms of, we did push back the launch date, actually, because we didn't think we were ready and we wanted to try and get things as good as we possibly could. So actually, we started earlier, and I think we originally thought it would go live about December the year before it actually went live, and we kept pushing it back till we'd got as many of the issues resolved as we actually could. So the original project plan was to go earlier, but we kept pushing it back because we wanted to resolve as many of those issues as we possibly could. I'm not an ICT, I don't work for ICT, I can't confess to know absolutely. I think part of the challenge is we had sought it in the previous inspection, so it had been sort of, to use vehicle parlance, it was like an MOT flag, fix it for next time sort of report when we were previously inspected. So I think that's why we were keen to try and sort it out, if that makes sense.
That's right. Absolutely right. I think because the compliance thing's kind of risk-based, we were aware of the risks, and we just effectively been advised to resolve by the March 22 date. If we hadn't done, we'd have had to have, probably it would have been very difficult for us to defer again. I think it's fair to say, but without, obviously that's an issue for ICT, not for parking. So I won't want to speak directly for them, but that's my understanding.
All good. Thank you, Councillor Pearson. Councillor Kilbane.
No, thank you, Chair, and thanks for the report, Dave and James. I've got a few quick-fire questions about information that's not in here that I think maybe should be in here. So, first of all, how much is the system cost, and what's been its impact on revenue collection?
I can't tell you what it costs off the top of my head, I'm afraid. I can write back to the committee and let them know what the annual licence fee is. And in terms of revenue collection, there's not a direct correlation between the new system and the old system. As Councillor Pearson's alluded to, bits of parking have gone down, bits of parking income have gone up as a result over that time. I can't say which are due to the system and which are due to other factors. Overall, I can tell you we're up in terms of parking income, but I can't tell you the causes of that. But I will find out the cost and make sure that's communicated to to the committee.
Thanks. If you can, the full cost of the system, not just the cost of the licensing would be useful. What key performance indicators are you using to measure its success or failure?
So there'll be a number of KPIs. The key one is the data that we get back as a service to manage our resource. So in terms of the reports we get back in terms of parking contraventions, in terms of enforcement, those KPIs now work. The other key KPI is that we can now create the correlation between the income we see from PCNs and the actual PCN issued. So historically, there was a sum of money received into the council's account, but there was no direct link back to the PCN. So that was a very manual process of having to work out the outstanding ones and then deal with those. That's a much slicker process. So again, we can share the KPI data sheet with the committee.
So are we measuring whether or not it's had an impact on the amount of patrols, amount of ground that can be covered by the patrols? Are we measuring the amount of complaints that are coming in that are taking up customer services time? I know, there's some information in here, isn't there, about how way back in September, your calls doubled, more than doubled, although I don't know if that's in time or just number of calls. And there's also some information in here about how 1 in 5 people who are computer literate, so they weren't opting out of the scheme, but they are computer literate. 1 in 5 people using the system needed officer intervention in order to be able to use it. But that's going back to sort of March. So how much of those things being measured to tell, has it given us more time for wardens to go around and inspect bays, or, how exactly do we know what's happening with this scheme?
So I think in terms of that question, the civil enforcement officer deployment won't have changed as a result of this system. Might be more efficient. So for instance, as a CEO, the system now allows them to scan registration numbers as they walk down the street rather than punching them in automatically. So it's become more efficient for them in that sense. I'll let Dave talk about some of the contact centre data.
I think on the CEOs as well, it's worth remembering that they were already used mobile devices. So this was a next generation of a mobile device, which James is describing. And then in terms of customer services, the data from mid-March to mid-September, which, apologies, I should have put the years on there. That was 21. Yes, cost, it's 21 to 22. Sorry. That was reflective of the amount of interventions that had to be made particularly in the first 2 months. So that became more efficient over time. There were less interventions over time.
The CEOs tell me that when they scan the number, it was quite often coming up as not having a permit, and they'd be halfway through filling out the ticket when it would go through the system and say, oh, I know, actually, it does have a permit. So has that glitch been sorted out now?
My understanding is that the civil enforcement officers know that they are subject to network issues in the same way they were on their previous mobile devices. So it sometimes takes a minute for the information to update.
So it's not necessarily more efficient than just looking in the window screen to see if it's got a permit.
Yeah, they can do more cars, so that's why it's more efficient.
But if there's a delay with the system processing the data, surely you just look in a window, you see if there's a ticket or not. If you've got to wait a minute for the scan to go through, surely that takes longer.
I think the point is they are not meant to do a car and wait. They would walk a street and scan the whole lot, then get the reports about whether there's any to go back to.
But I'm being informed that they'd be in the process of actually producing the ticket when the scanner would then come back and say, oh no, this has got a car. And there were similar issues with Minster badges. So people were being scanned as not having Minster badges, and then halfway through, again, the process, it would come through because there was delays with the network.
I'm happy to have that discussion with the CEOs just to see if that was an isolated incident or whether that was something that's common. I don't believe it's a common instance. But what I would say, Councillor Kilbane, is the devices are subject to network connectivity and things like that, like they were previously with the Imperial system.
Okay, and just one more. Sorry, I got sidetracked there in terms of the detail of the report. So in terms of the public sector network compliance, was it not possible just to update our old system or to make our old system compliant? Did we have to go for a whole new system?
The old system, the supplier would stop supporting, so they couldn't, it would need a completely new system. Yes, it couldn't have been updated.
But could we just not have continue to use the old system, but with a new way of collecting the data and making sure it was secure?
No, you would have to have a new system to be PSN compliant. Sorry.
We all, sorry to interrupt, councillor, did you want to come back first? All I was going to say was we needed to do a new procurement on the system as well. That had been a long time coming, so we needed to explore the market, and the version of the previous system we had was no longer supported, and it's basically an old version that was incapable of being upgraded. So the framework that we use, which in simple terms was a framework for civil enforcement systems, the company that we previously went with were on that framework, so they were able to compete. The Taranto system was comfortably better than any of the competitors when we went through the procurement. But I know that's not strictly a question, but I'm just trying to give you a bit more information.
Sure, but I guess the question that I'm asking is, could we not have continued with a paper-based system and been compliant?
So there was no requirement on the public sector network compliance to go to virtual permits, and that was purely about the data security of that old system. The decision to go to virtual permits was partly influenced by this committee saying, go and explore virtual permits and self-serve. So that's what we did. That's what the decision makers endorsed as a process through exec and exec member decisions.
Sorry, just for information on that, you know, from memory, the decision was either 2018 or 2019.
2019.
Yeah, it was pre-election. I wasn't the executive member at the time, but I was a member of that scrutiny committee that looked at the different options, and one of the recommendations to the executive from scrutiny was to consider a more digital based system, and that was endorsed by the then executive, so that the process was already in place and agreed prior to the current administration.
Can I just be absolutely clear? So there was no legal requirement to move to a non-paper based system?
If I may, because I appreciate the partial history lesson from Councillor De Gorn and the partial, not me, Gov, it was pre the last election comment. I would also say that after the last election, an update on this transition was brought to EMP sometime in 2019, because I was an ordinary committee member. I remember it coming, and I remember at that time various questions were raised, which still 3 years later, we don't really seem to have, at least in the papers, clear answers on, such as, is this really more efficient? What are the financials? The points that myself and other committee members back in 2019 hammered home then haven't really landed. Those were around sort of, how is this going to work for those not online or those who struggle online? You were the exec member at that time. I know administrations come and go, but there have been moments since your time in the role that this issue has been discussed and preemptive concerns been raised that don't seem to have been properly acted on. Councillor Hook, you've been extremely patient. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just really concerned about what people have been saying about elderly people and other people who aren't, just basically getting more lonely because they're finding it so hard to use the system. And I know that you can move to the manual system, the old-fashioned paper system, but are you sure everybody is using that and it's working for them? And also, what about, because we all deteriorate, And as you get older, you drive shorter distances. So if you want to pop around to your friends for a cup of tea, well, you'd previously walked, now you want to drive. And eventually, like my next door neighbour, can't even see a computer anyway, let alone use one. So no, luckily he doesn't drive either. So it's just, are these people, can they get assurance that they're not going to fall through any holes?
I think what I'd say is it comes back to the point I made earlier about if we can move the vast majority of people to self-serve and online, that actually gives the resource we have got left more time to support those who need it most. Can I be sure we capture all of those? The honest answer is no, I can't be absolutely confident we capture everybody who we should be. What I can be clear about is we try our best to do that, and we have sent messages to all ward councillors about how to access the paper system so that you're all aware of how to signpost people, if nothing else. So yeah, I can't give you 100% confidence in it, obviously, but I think there are recommendations. The purpose of this committee is to look at the policy and look at how it could be developed. Then, more than happy to take ideas about how you can capture more of those people in that process. Dave, I don't know whether you wanted to come in.
James couldn't read my writing, so he had to pass it on. So and ICT do some work on digital inclusion as well. So I think the two points I would, sorry, James, you want to come back?
No.
The 2 points I was just going to make on digital inclusion is that we're not going to assume that older people aren't IT literate, because I think many of them are, although the point's taken. But the second point is that we do work with groups that through the ICT work streams identify to support them to be more IT literate or to include digitally, or as James said, we try and help people through. I mean, the whole offline process was designed to support people who weren't able to do it. Unfortunately, because generally the system was overwhelmed at the beginning, it just completely closed that channel off. And that's left, I think, my read of it, having looked at a lot of the complaints that come through to myself and Graham, and we work out responses and things like that, or the team who also do an excellent job on this. We've seen the kind of feedback from people who are struggling and are really and we're sensitive to that, and we're trying to put things in place that would make sure that people who are really struggling get the help they need when they come through through customer services.
Thanks for those answers. If I may, I just want to make a quick comment, and I've got various hands. I would go as far as saying it's beyond doubt that this idea that the sort of savings in various forms that we'll make from a mainly digital service will free up capacity to support those who aren't online. I don't think that's happened at all. And Councillor Hook asked if people are falling through the gaps. I mean, that has happened. It's a fact. It's happened on many occasions, and it needs to be a learning point, and we will get onto recommendations at the end. And I would also add as well that yes, digital inclusion activities, lovely, but there are some people who just won't be online ever, and they're going to be alive for decades. Like my dad's 54, he's awful online, and I think he ain't going to change his ways. So, we can do all the digital inclusion stuff till the cows come home. We still need to serve those people who, for whatever reason, aren't comfortable in front of the screen. That was a speech. I'm sorry.
So just to come back on that, just to be clear, there are some savings for both the contact centre in the work that has happened. So there are savings in there. What I was trying to get across was what we need to do is make sure that the resource that remains is targeted at those people that need it most. That was the point I was trying to make.
Well, it's difficult to make any sense of that when it's not really in the papers, and we have touched on that. Councillor Taylor, very briefly, and then we'll get back onto the main order.
Thank you, Chair, because this is actually my main criticism, James, is I think it was unwise to reduce the capacity in the call centre in advance of going live. And you do say that it's towards the end of paragraph 10, it's mentioned. So I believe that of the number of customer complaints to the council, it's always been a high percentage which are related to parking issues. So I think it was a great mistake to take those financial savings at that time, because it's clearly led to a great deal of pressure for the existing staff. And as we know, some staff have departed the council because of the pressure, and for the residents of the city. So that's my main criticism. I know that installation of any major IT system is fraught with problems, and there are some massive national systems which have been disastrous. So I think this is not been a good experience for staff or residents, but I do think in the future it will prove to be the right thing to do. If I might say so, Chair, if IT is doing some work on digital inclusion, I think that is a good topic for scrutiny. I don't know whether it falls to this committee or whether it should fall to another committee to look at that, but I do think it is important. And even when I was an IT professional, I was always very concerned that the councils taking a decision to make systems purely digital. We're not like a bank or a private organisation that can just say we're going entirely digital, and our customers who don't like that can take their business elsewhere. They can't as a council, and we have to include them. And I think that's what you were saying earlier on, Chair.
Yeah, I think it's a good shout, Councillor Taylor. It might be something that falls with CSMC, but I've made a note of it. It was in my thinking around recommendations as well. We have two very, very patient members on the committee. I've got Councillor Cuthbertson and then Councillor Daubney. Thank you so much for your tolerance.
Thank you, Chair. I apologise if the question I'm going to ask has already been covered, because my hearing aid batteries both ran out as your presentation started. So odd bits of that were just a blur. First of all, can you, on page 10, paragraph 33, can you explain to me what that means, please?
The calls coming through to the customer centre.
Listen.
Yeah, so the calls that have come through to the customer centre have returned to the levels that they were at before the system went live.
Right, that's the call level.
Call levels,
okay,
and the demand to, because it's probably worth understanding that there are 3 services involved, well 4 if you include ICT. There's customer services who do the customer interactions, and then there's some business support resource who deal with some of the transactions, support some of the transactions. So they manage the email queue, for example. And then we've got quite a small team in parking back office team who support them. So the point there was that the although these things ebb and flow, the call volumes and volumes in the inbox for business support were back to a normal level, and they'd seen a heightened level when we first implemented in 2021.
Okay. So going on to paragraph 30, you talk about in the first 6 months of the year, as Councillor Kilbane pointed out, 1 in 5 of the permits issued had officer intervention.
Yeah.
My question is, how many permits would you issue in the course of a 12-month period?
It's probably double that. It'd be something like,
yeah, I expected you to say
yeah,
that, but
yeah.
I just wondered if that.
I haven't got the numbers off.
So is that same level of intervention, has that been maintained across all effectively 30,000 permits?
No.
So what level is it? What level are you interviewing at now?
I can bring some refreshed stats back to, or report that back through. I think what I would say is the 1/5 level reflected the amount of interaction we had in the first couple of months. So I would expect, even though I haven't got the figures to hand, that ratio would be larger in favour of permits that haven't had officer intervention.
Thank you. Got a couple of other questions. On page 8, paragraph G, item G, where it says residents can't take permits. I'm assuming that this allows a resident to report
a suspect vehicle. Yeah. Right. So my question is, what level is that running at? And have we got the staffing to deal with such direct reports of unpermitted vehicles?
So, did you want to come in? Yeah, so this isn't something that we've currently implemented. So this is something that we'll get in the future. But the parking hotline, which you probably didn't catch this bit, Graham, when Graham here, he described the circumstance around the current resident hotline, which you ring through for, and they have the capacity there to manage the number of interactions that have been made by residents. So when we talk about call volumes, that's purely about our own customer services team, not about the parking hotline.
Okay. One other question, if I may, Chair. Toronto has been in existence for a bit and presumably was running when the decision was taken to adapt that product to what we need to do here. I'm just curious about some of the things that have happened where, for instance, the customer is enabled to register an address. How can that be?
Sorry, go on.
Well, I was going to say there is a national gazetteer, isn't there?
Yeah. So one of the difficulties when we went live was we had to match the data that was in the old system with things like the street gazetteer. So some of the issues we got weren't necessarily to do with the address. It was to do with how they identified themselves in the original system. So, for example, I could have called myself David Atkinson in the original system and Dave Atkinson in the new system. I mean, that's quite simple, but that wouldn't have created a match, for example. But we did have a number of issues around the address database, particularly where new addresses had been added to the national or the local gazetteer, which obviously forms the national gazetteer. But I think one of the things we knew there would be a percentage of when we went live was issues in terms of addresses and data that we had in the existing Imperial system.
And I think just to add, the complicating factor is that the system talks to the DVLA database, talks to the DVLA database as well. So actually making sure addresses match up in DVLA, the old database, and the gazetteer and the new database gives 4 points for things to get mismatched. So it only needs one of them to have an error in it and the thing doesn't work. Because it's checking your vehicle.
I just find it difficult to believe that in a matching routine, for instance, you can't devise a way of comparing two data sets. I'm sorry, excuse me, sorry. I just find it difficult to believe that writing a matching routine, you've got two or even three data sets, and you can't find a simple way of comparing the three and identifying discrepancies. And if need be, just giving the operator the facility to say, well, actually, it wasn't David, it's Dave.
That's what the contact centre can do to a certain extent, but the resident can't necessarily do. And we don't have access to the data sets. Kick me out. We don't have access to the data sets of DVLA. We can do a lookup, but we don't have access to the full database.
Okay, I won't talk about how you could do that, but I take what you've said. Thank you very much for your help.
Thanks, Councillor Cuthbertson. I mean, if you did have further information, it'd be good to share that outside of the committee, perhaps.
Well, you can actually accumulate data from the DVLA database simply by retaining everything you check. That increases the amount of data you've got to verify against each time.
We can't do that. It's against data protection. We can't harvest the information from another provider's database because that won't be for the use that the data was provided in the first place. So that would be a breach of data protection to do.
Yeah, okay, well.
So sorry, I understand what you're saying. I've worked in data cleansing for a number of years, and it is a very complex issue, matching addresses. It always has been, still is. All you would need is DVLA to have
diverged from the LLPG for 3 months and then there'd be a.
No need to apologise, by the way. I appreciate the clarity. James?
And DVLA do audit the way you use their data. So they come out and check us about the way we're using their data.
Cool, thank you. I've got Councillor Daubney, then I've got Councillor Kilbane.
Thank you, Chair. And can I thank the officers for their report, which is, I think, quite comprehensive and given my colleagues a good chance to critique some of the issues you've been facing. On page 7, can I just ask you clearly explain why on the visitor permits you can't have more than 20 at a time, and also you helpfully tell us that suppliers are working with the council to work on a longer term solution to allow the 200 to be purchased in a single transaction. Clearly, I can see that why 20 might be too few for some people in certain circumstances. Can I ask how close they might be to coming up with that kind of solution?
It's a challenge, and anyone that's worked in IT will know the biggest challenges come where two systems meet, and this is a challenge where two systems meet. So it's not a particular problem with the parking system, it's not a particular problem with the finance system, but trying to get the two to work together to solve the problem is where we're at. So yes, work is absolutely ongoing to try and resolve that. But if I'm honest, I wouldn't say we're imminently near solving it, but we are doing all we can with suppliers to try and get as close as we can. The fix we put in of being very clear about the 20 was trying to make sure at the start of the problems, if a resident tried to order 200, the system crashed and kicked them out. That obviously is unacceptable as a customer journey and really difficult and frustrating. It's those sorts of issues that cause the peaks in the contact centre. By being really clear that you could only order 20 at a time, we've solved that. Now, very frustrating for the resident, but you could order all 200 in one day if you sat there and did them as separate transactions. It doesn't stop you doing that if you wanted, but it would drive me round the bend. So I understand why it drives residents round the bend, which is why we're trying to solve it.
Thanks for that, James.
Councillor Kilbane.
Oh, thanks, Chair. Obviously, this has been a major feature of our inboxes since it was introduced in September 2021. And when we knock on doors, I'd say 1 in every 2 households complains about the digital Respark system for some of the key things that we'll come on to later. But about 6 days ago, I put a very neutral post on the Nextdoor site to say this meeting was happening. If anybody had any experiences, let me know what they are. I've been inundated with emails from that, and I've collated them. And these are complaints and questions, things that people don't understand about the system. And these are compliments. So there's quite a telling response from the public. So I've just got a few questions from the public, if I may, first of all, and I'll just do them in batches just for time, really. They want to know why the system doesn't work with Safari, given that it's the 2nd most popular browser in the world. They want to know what the projected cost savings are. They want to know how often does a Respark bay get routinely inspected? And they want to know, couldn't people just print off their own permits to display in their windows?
Cover Safari. My understanding is the system does work with Safari, so I would have to take that. Councillor Kilbane, if you could pass the individual things on. It's Chrome, it doesn't work with it, which isn't popular. Well, it's popular, but.
So I think in answer to that, I think we think it does work with Safari, but we'll double check. In terms of the cost saving, I'd need to go back through the full council papers to pick up the savings, but I know there was a saving for the contact centre, so we can clarify that. It wasn't a saving within my service area. Residence bays, the intelligence that the system produces taskings of where and data sets and business intelligence of where contraventions are most likely to be found. So the deployment of civil enforcement officers is partly based on that. Obviously, the deployment of the permit checker for residents will help influence and create an even stronger data set for that, but it's done on a sort of risk-based approach. And the print-off issue is, as I say, I think it's to do with the security behind knowing how many permits have been issued. So I think the permits as they were previously used to have a, what's the word I'm looking for, watermark type affair to make sure that they were secure and there was no abuse of Respark permits.
Can I just check on the routine inspection answer, James? So are you saying that some bays will never be routinely checked and others will be checked frequently?
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying it's partly data driven. I don't have the data of knowing what the minimum patrols are in residential streets. I don't know whether Dave knows off the top of his head, but
Not off the top of my head, but Councillor Kilburn, if you can identify the areas that where residents have raised concerns about, happy to speak to the teams.
I think it's just more that they want to know if they've paid for a permit, then somebody comes and checks that everybody in that parking base paid for a permit on a regular basis, wherever they are in the scheme, really.
we do patrol Respark areas. That's the reassurance. I can't tell you a minimum number, which I think was the question, but I will we'll double check if we can produce some stats for you on that.
That would be very good. Just some other residents' questions. Why can we only have one account per household? Because this means people having to book the permits through other people's account within the household. Can we have it as an app? And when you go into your account, why aren't there saved registration numbers? Why do you have to keep putting them in every time? So that why isn't there just one that you can click on and say, yep, that one?
So whether it'll be an app, but I think the next variation, and Graham and Dave may know better than me, will have better mobile functionality. So it will render, I think is a phrase, on a phone better than the current version does. That is one of the improvements that's coming. I've not picked up the save registration numbers one, but that's something we can certainly feed back if it's not in the next variation of the bill to the suppliers.
And the one account per household?
I don't know the answer to that. I would need to check out the logic behind the one account per household.
Is that enough from you, Councillor Kilbane, or do you?
I have lots more to say, but not questions to the officers at this time.
Fair play, thank you. Councillor de Gorn?
Yeah, just one thing which I think has come out, and Councillor Kilbane hasn't specifically mentioned it, but it was alluded to by the speaker, was the issue about of access to physical visitors permits. I mean, the officers made reference to the professional carers having a paper permit, but I think you know, from the feedback that I've had, it does seem that and just from my own experience in the past week, that having something you can physically leave for a visitor, rather than, as the speaker said, having to be called out of the meeting to put a registration number in because you got someone called at the house. You know, for having that flexibility, I think would be something we need to look at. So I mean, the reference to the, I'm glad that we have managed to resolve the issue about professional carers. But if they've got a permit, I'm not sure whether they've got a permit for the whole city or whether they have to have one specific to each zone, but that would be different from the individual daily permit that voluntary care, you know, relatives would probably need.
Councillor Kilbane?
I think it does raise an interesting point, Councillor, to go on, and something that's missing from this report is the equalities impact assessment of the system. So I've a friend in my ward actually who has 3 different carers coming in on a daily basis, and they come in different cars, and she's expected to input the registration numbers for each different carers. Each one comes, whereas in the past she just used to pass a ticket. Do we know what the equalities impact of moving to a digital system has been?
we did some work on it at the beginning of the process. I don't think we've done a review since as part of this review. Because there's obviously no decision point at this stage. If we were doing a further update to make decisions about changes, that would be clear. But just to be clear, I'm looking back at the decision Councillor de Gorn made back in 19 about which permits would be virtual, and the carers permit, I had it a second ago. The attendance carers permit was not changing to virtual. So it was very clear, retain a paper version of attendance permit, remove to virtual permits.
Just
So
to
if they've been asked to use a digital permit, Councillor Kilbane, send them our way, because that shouldn't be what carers, paid for carers are using as a way forward.
So just to clarify on that point, you say attendance carers permit. I'm, you know, in layperson's term, is that someone who receives attendance allowance, or is it anybody who's attending as a carer? That perhaps needs to be made clearer on our system.
Well, as I say, we can clarify it, but it's where as I say, it's not a family member turning up. It is a care company turning up to provide support to one of our residents, and they shouldn't need a virtual permit. And the person who's being cared for is not expected to access the system to load that information.
I think there are so many different types of people turning up to do all kinds of different types of things in people's houses, let alone getting into unregistered houses where you've got third parties coming to do building or cleaning work or something. I mean, there could be a whole sort of scrutiny in itself, but I think in particular, you know, what the equalities impact has been of this would be very useful to know.
Thanks, Councillor Kilbane. I think that's something I want to pick up in the recommendations bit at the end of this. I had two questions, I think, to close with, and they're not necessarily about implementation, but I've had residents raise it with me around Respark. One is there any possibility of charging different amounts for permits depending on the enforceable time that those permits cover? Because I have had comment from officers that, and I don't know if it's been in error or not, that whether you had Respark in place for a few hours or a whole day, the cost would be the same, which to me just seems a bit odd. Is that something that we could do? Could we charge less for Respark in areas where school time pressures are highest?
That sounds like a political question, given that the cost of residence permits is something that's determined by full council in budget council every year.
I mean, it's,
you know, obviously what you're asking is, might there be differential rates? Well, obviously that is something which could be put forward, but there would be a cost implication, a financial implication for the administration about, you know, changing and potentially more complexity than we've already got, which is plenty.
well, if I may, Councillor de Gorn, every single question in these committees is political. The extent of how big the P is will depend on the question, and it was simply trying to seek some clarity on the current position and what is possible. That was literally it. But we can come back to that.
Is it something that's done in other authorities? Do we know?
I'm not aware without doing some work on that, I'm afraid, Councillor Taylor. I mean, my response was going to be there is no legal steer one way or the other about what the charge is and how long those last. And I appreciate it might not be the one response you wanted, Councillor Taylor, but I was going to respond to say, and it is for councillors to determine at full council, I'm afraid, the charges, but there's no legal requirement one way or another around it.
I mean, that's a totally sufficient response, and I appreciate it. The next question, I guess, is similar, in that should we crack this and properly sort out the challenges that we've had, or teething problems, as Councillor de Gorn said in the past, and it does become a very efficient scheme. Do you think there's opportunities potentially, should members want it, to reduce the cost of Respark because of the efficiencies gained? And I'm asking that purely because Respark, for the most part, works, and that's why it exists. But areas that would benefit from it, there's certain areas that would struggle more with the cost as it currently is, even though they'd really benefit from having such a scheme. And I'm always thinking of opportunities, of course I am, we're all politicians. And I'm thinking, well, hang on a minute, if this could be really efficient, this new system, maybe we can pass on some of those savings to the residents to enable or increase accessibility to the benefits of Respark. Or would such efficiencies not be that substantial? I mean, I'll take officers' answers. I'll take Councillor de Gaugne's answers.
I'll start with an opener then. I think the way York operates Respark is it's radiated out from the centre. So where Respark tends to follow high levels of parking pressure. So you need and because of the way we roll out Respark, it's done on a ballot, and residents get involved in deciding whether they have Respark or not. Therefore, that decision, to be fair, in the main, except one or two very rare examples, they make that decision based on knowing the price they're going to have to pay for it.
Yeah.
So bearing in mind that's how we work, I think part of the challenge is the sheer number of permits we've got, each with their own discrete eligibility criteria. I think the way to crack some of this, arguably, is to try to streamline that whole raft of permits into a shorter list. The challenge with that is some people will drop out of that eligibility criteria inevitably. As you say, we go in for, I can't remember the number off the top of my head, we've got 80 different permit types at the moment, say. Trying to get that list down to 10, 12, 15 in a way that captures everybody is very, very hard. There will be some people that fall out of that criteria. So in answer to your question, yes, you know, the charge you set is absolutely council's prerogative, and the income from parking needs to be spent on wider transport impacts. So even with the income we make now, it's still spent on transport impacts. Other cities have seen a rollout of Respark on the basis of not on resident vote so much, more on the basis of we're applying this to the whole city. Now, sometimes that goes with a decrease in price to make it more attractive for the whole, but it potentially gives you opportunities to look at the transport impacts across the city. So you, rather than becoming a tool to manage a community or a tool, a street, it becomes a tool to manage commuter parking across the whole city, for instance. So it can be used in different ways as a set of legislation. So I think most of the, as I say, the contact centre had a saving linked to this, which was actually taken before the, as we said in the paper, was actually taken before it was rolled out. If there, I'm not sure we'll see massive changes in efficiency because there isn't much left behind it, if that makes sense. There's the people in the contact centre, but as we've identified, they're still going to need to support those people that don't have access to IT or need support to get what they need. So on that basis, I don't think there are significant efficiencies, but there are options, obviously, for the council when setting its budget to decide what it wants to charge for this Respark sort of process.
Thanks, James. Councillor de Gaune, did you have anything to add? And then I think we'll move on to recommendations.
Certainly, you know, when I first sort of looked at the issue of residents parking probably 5 or more years ago, Councillor Taylor and myself go back at least a decade on this issue. The cost of the permit was always the barrier in terms of providing what otherwise majority of residents would want to see. But as we all know, with austerity and cuts to the council budgets, the difficulty is that even though we're making savings, there's always more and more things that are critical that we need to spend that money on. Even within transport, supporting sustainable transport, bus routes, whatever it might be. It all calls on the transport budget, so it's difficult to see how we could reduce that, other than as being suggested by the officers, if we were to take a completely different approach from one we currently do.
Thanks, Councillor de Gorme. If members are okay with this, I'd like to talk about possible recommendations. It's a fairly open brief for this paper. It says here, it's recommended that the committee note the content of the report, which we have done, and positive progress, and consider any recommendations. Reason to ensure lessons are learned. Councillor Kilbane.
No, thanks, Chair. I think positive progress is whitewashing a situation that is still a total nightmare 14 months after it was went live. So from my perspective, I mean, and these emails are all just from the last week. I'm not going to go further back or talk about the 20+ parking charge notices me and Councillor Crawshaw must have been involved in overturning that were wrongly applied following the introduction of digital Respark in the ward. And I would say to people, if you do receive a parking charge notice to do with the digital Respark system, please get in touch with your councillor. We are meeting quite a lot of people who were wrongly fined and didn't challenge it. And let alone trying to get refunds has been problematical. People buying permits for a day that then the builder doesn't turn up and you've spent the money already. It's not like your old scratch cards. But from this, just from the last week, people emailing me following the next door post. The system is a total nightmare to use, and I am in no way IT illiterate. I spent hours trying to pay for visitor parking through the portal. In the end, I phoned up and spoke to a council officer who actually recommended I purchase the maximum amount of paper permits allowed in 1 year to ensure that you had no further issues. This is an absolute waste of my time and CYC's money. I've spent approximately 3 hours on the phone with the help desk trying to work out how the system works in real time. I had decorators in and it was a total pain. I had to resort from borrowing from other people in the street, which I think you're not supposed to do. As I understand it, if we see a car that we don't recognise, we're advised to call a parking hotline. This could mean ringing frequently and causing unnecessary work on call-outs for the wardens. However, if we do not contact them, do we just have to put up with it and accept that we cannot get parked? And I've got hundreds of these, well, scores, but this will be the last one. Yeah. And this is what comes through all of the conversations that we've been having, the emails that are coming in, are people saying, please, can we bring back the permits, especially the visitor permits? Some evenings, the whole length of Nunthorpe Drive is covered in cars. If you ring after 8 p.m, no one comes out to check. And there was a resident who was going to come and address the committee tonight, but ironically, he couldn't work out how to register online to come and tell you his experience. But he lives near Millennium Bridge, where people will go and park in order to walk the dogs or go for a stroll, etc. And on a daily basis, people are coming very close to blows over whether they are or aren't allowed to park in a particular place. And that's because we are asking the residents to police it. And that is totally unacceptable. And when the new system comes in that allows the residents to check whether or not somebody is allowed to park there, that's kind of just ramping up resident policing. We should not be asking residents to get involved in policing who can and who can't park in particular areas. It's causing a major issue, certainly in my ward. I'm assuming it's causing a major issue in other wards. And what people have said to me, why have you fixed something that wasn't broken? Can we please go back to having something in the window screen that people can see that people have got a right to park there? And can we go back to paper permits, which I believe is the system that they use in Sheffield? They're still on paper permits, and in a lot of those London authorities that were also quoted in this report, they're still on paper permits. So what I would like to put forward as a recommendation is that we get a system in place that people can print something off. It can't be that difficult to make it watertight, that they can display in the car to show that they're allowed to park there, and that we go back to making sure people have got ready access to the cardboard scratch-off parking permits. People will migrate to the system online when it's easier to use than using the system physically. You know, what we should be having here is a system that people want to use, because it's a lot easier just to tap in the number from wherever you are in the world, to allowing somebody to park in the zone. That's the way the migration should happen. The way it has happened is people have pretty much been forced off the physical system and onto the digital system. And I will finish on this. I only became aware some months ago that you could still buy paper permits when I was talking to a resident on the doorstep, and she told me that because she has to care for her mother, and the mother's got lots of different family carers coming in, and the mother needed to have the permits, and her mother's not online, that she went to West officers and she refused to leave this building until they sold her some paper permits. And that's how I discovered they were still available.
Well, if they are still available, I think it's a reasonable recommendation in my view. I'm open to members' views. I don't want to act unilaterally. I did have a few others to suggest. One was that the executive member is tasked with setting up whatever you want to call it. It would need to basically offer meaningful troubleshooting of all the issues that this is raising for residents, but involving residents themselves, especially groups that represent or advocate on behalf of the elderly or disabled, those who aren't online. You know, that would be as much of a steer as I'd give. I'm open to others fine tuning it, but I'm suggesting that because I don't want this to disappear and come back to another scrutiny meeting in a year or 18 months with new members, and we might have moved forward on one or two things, but there's still 5 or 6 glaring problems over there. I think this needs picking up and running with as a going issue. Councillor de Gorne?
Just to respond to your point about some sort of for user forum or whatever, you know, I'm quite open to discuss how members feel something like that would work, and obviously, you know, consulting with officers as to how we could best use that. I mean, the stories that Councillor Kilbane has recounted are, you know, genuine concerns that residents have come forward with. Some of them, you know, I could take issue with, but on the whole, I do recognise that there are issues which we do need to try and resolve, and so I would be happy to have some sort of representative forum. Appreciate that, you know, we'd want to try and manage that in some way. But
well, yeah, and I think there's a discussion to be had maybe outside of the meeting, because I think it would need to involve relevant officer time if this is going to be meaningful, rather than people meet you, tell you what they think, you say you're going to go back and speak to officers. Very little might happen. Look, whatever that ends up looking like, it could be something that goes to an exec member decision session. I don't know if we can even make those recommendations. And Dem Services will check. Thank you. Councillor Dave Taylor.
I'm just concerned about raising people's expectations beyond what's possible to resolve. The issues that Peter's just read out, I know other councillors have seen similar correspondence from their residents. I know Andy de Gorne has had correspondence like that in abundance, and has been in consultation with the officers who have been in consultation with the providers of the system to resolve these problems. Would a forum for residents achieve that any quicker? It would give those residents more information about what is happening with the system, what has been wrong, what has been put right, what is yet to be put right, but there is a plan for it. Yeah. They will learn something about it. but frankly, I don't know whether it will achieve anything faster as a result of having a forum.
I think it's a valid pushback, Councillor Taylor. I'd just reiterate again that how this looks or operates in practice, I'm not too prescriptive over, so long as it's genuine and that this doesn't get lost and months pass and picked up again. I'm quite open to officers and the exec member working that out, but it really needs to have meaningful involvement with affected residents. Councillor Kilbane, I think, yeah.
I mean, I've got to say, I mean, a forum will be useful, and really there should have been a forum when it was introduced to make sure that it was tested on users before it was actually introduced for them to go live with, but be that as it's may. I think the concern that we have from residents is actually they don't know if the person parked in their zone is allowed to park there or not. And that will always be the case until there's a signifier in the vehicle that says, yes, I can park there. Now, how you get to that, you know, whether you print it off yourself, whether you can print off your own visitor permits, whether you've still got people who are ordering the scratch off cards, you know, I don't really care how you do it, but you won't resolve this problem until the residents can see that somebody is allowed to park there.
Yeah, just on that, I mean, I think we have heard from the officers that the intention is clearly to have this permit checker as part of the system upgrade. I do take the point though about physical visitor permits, you know, for residents with a household permit once a year, you know, they have to get taxed, they have to do the MOT, the various other things. Quite often they're going to be doing that online. It's once a year renewing a permit, but the visitor's permit is quite different in that you don't necessarily know somebody's going to be calling round. You might have a burst pipe, you know, have you got a supply of physical permits? You can leave it for whoever's coming to fix a burst pipe or whatever. It's much more difficult if you've got to do it online.
Councillor Taylor.
I'm persuaded by Pete's points about having a physical permit in the car. And what persuades me is your assertion that Sheffield still do this, despite having the Taranto system, they still have permit. Please, James, enlighten us.
Sheffield have a range of paperless permits, as they call them, rather than virtual. So they do have some paperless permits. I've just checked the website now. I can certainly say most of the London boroughs are on virtual permits, having come from working there and implementing the same schemes there. So yeah, there are other places that do absolutely run virtual permits. I'm not saying all of Sheffield's permits are virtual by any stretch of imagination, but certainly their website is.
Permits on. That's what we're talking about.
Can we just investigate it?
Can we keep things relatively controlled? Councillor Pearson, is that a hand? Yeah. Okay, cool.
Thanks, Jay. Yeah, my only concern, obviously, there's a couple of arguments against going for a paper ticket. One would be obviously the use of paper. Second would be, I don't necessarily think that it is up to the residents to police this. I think it should be policed by the authority. Clearly there is a method to check, or there will be a method to check whether a car parked outside your house or on your street has the permit or not. It will be online. I think if you're that bothered about it, there's clearly a way. And what the other thing would be, having stickers in windows is probably not, you know, it's something we're probably going to get away from in terms of removing tax disc, removing all the other things. In terms of actually having physical obstructions on your windscreen, it's just not a great idea in terms of driving safety.
Thanks for the contribution, Councillor Pearson. I did have a couple of other recommendations. I know this is getting long, but you know, we've talked about this for over 2 hours, so we might as well have a meaningful conclusion rather than just let it disappear. And it has been offered already by officers. I think we do need the financials on this and a sense of how efficiency is being assessed and performance is being assessed. I think that should be circulated to all councillors. I think it'd be good to have that to hand whenever residents ask us about this. So that'd be one recommendation I'd add, because the lack of numbers is prominent in this report. Councillor de Gorme.
Just to clarify, when you say financials, what you have in mind there? 'Cause
Well, what I have in mind, if you were listening at the time, Councillor Kilbane asked for the full cost of the new system,
Mhm.
and officers didn't have it to hand, and they said that they'd be willing to share it.
Okay.
And then we had a discussion about KPIs too,
Mhm.
which aren't also in this report. So it's difficult without that to sort of say to people, bear with us, it'll be worth it. I think that out of all the
Okay.
requests being.
And just, I think one of the other points that has been made is about the confidence that there is enforcement. So, you know, if there was at least some, as you say, some data about how frequently, on average, a street might be checked, you know, that type of information, and whether that varies across the city or.
Yeah, that too would be helpful in the very same way we have the same for street cleaning, you know, it's on the website, you know, some areas get it once every week, some get it once a month, whatever. And just anything to allow us to try and form some of measurement. And that would lead to more constructive discussions. At the minute, we've got a lot of problems that don't seem to be, well, some of them are being dealt with, but not all of them. So that'd be one recommendation on sharing information on the full cost, KPIs. Any objections or comments on that, colleagues? No, thank you. We'll come back to that on work plan. Thank you, Angela. And the final thing I was going to ask, when we will come back to the previous discussion, is we've had apologies in this meeting. I think it would be healthy and refreshing if a corporate press release could go out where an apology is given, because there's a handful of people who are going to watch this meeting, as much as I like to make it interesting and fail dramatically. I think something like that might be quite good for residents to see. You know, we hold our hands up. This is what we're going to do. This is what we're doing already. It doesn't need to be kicking the council to death. It can just be an acknowledgement piece. Councillor Kilbane?
If we could make sure those apologies were extended to the staff who had to deal with this when it was introduced, and who are still dealing with it on a daily basis.
I mean, yeah, totally agree, Councillor Kilbane. Sorry. I'd like the committee's views on it. I mean, would there be any objections to that if we asked executive member to work with comms on a piece on that?
Personally, I think it would be better if it was conjoined with something that was being done to resolve the problems, such as the installation of the next system. That we introduce this, we've got a new system coming in, we apologise for some cock up in the past.
Of course, and
rather than just issue an apology out of thin air at the moment.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was sort of, I shouldn't assume it goes without saying, but I'm sure corporate comms and Councillor de Gorme will want to pad it out to make it have some more to it than just we're sorry. I think that would be helpful.
Certainly, as has been suggested, you know, at the point when we are ready for the new software to be rolled out, we'll obviously need to communicate the changes that are and the benefits that will come from that, and an apology for the experience that we're aware of and in this report, you know, when it was first introduced. And I know obviously hindsight's a wonderful thing, but you know, but clearly the expectation was that we wouldn't need quite that level of demand when it was initially rolled out. And I think for me, one of the key failings was the lack of appreciation, the fact that the systems wouldn't allow users to apply for a new one until their existing one had expired. You know, obviously we learned that with hindsight, but by then it was too late to do anything about it.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor de Gorme. Councillor Pearson.
Yeah, thanks. I'd agree with Councillor Dave Taylor in terms of we need to show progress on this. So I think it'd be great to see any press release, which I'm sure will come in future, include some of the statistics we've talked about tonight, and then perhaps we missed from this evening about the benefits of why going digital, what it brings about, and what improvements are planned.
Thank you, Councillor Pearson. So we've got one on costs and KPIs, one on an apology / this is what we're doing to improve things. Councillor Kilbane?
I just want to be absolutely clear. That correspondence I was reading out was from the last 6 days. The system is still not working. You know, we are nowhere near the progress we should have made in 14 months since it went live. And frankly, you know, it's just not good enough.
Personally, Councillor Kilbane, I don't disagree, and it would be a matter for Councillor de Gaugne's judgment to decide how much he wants to emphasise positive change and also acknowledge the live problems that still exist. You know, we don't want to get into the territory of drafting the thing for him, though I'm sure we'd have a lot of fun doing that. I'm delegating that to the executive member. Thank you. So that's so we've got costs and KPIs, public statement. This idea of some sort of troubleshooting group, whatever that looks like, whether it's online, in person, a bit of both. I don't think I saw committee's consent on that, but are people open to or happy with that and the executive member going away with officers to work on what that might look like? I'll take your feedback, Councillor de Gaugne, but I want to stress that we'll be making these recommendations for you.
Yeah,
as
you
a
appreciate
committee.
that. Yeah,
Sure.
just to add, as a suggestion to help with that. Certainly I'm aware of at least 2 correspondents in the last 7 days who've expressed willingness to support and offer their expertise. You know,
Great.
I'm sure Councillor Kilbane's probably had some as well along those lines. Appreciate, you know, what format but it might take, you know, whether it's a virtual meeting or whatever, you know, we can try and resolve that. But I think there are certainly residents who are willing to try and help us to move this forward, and I would very much support that.
Thanks. Thank you. Dave Taylor, Councillor Dave Taylor.
That's all right, you can call me David if you like. I'd like to make a recommendation, and I think this applies to the installation of all major systems really, but that you don't sack the support, that's a bad term, isn't it? That you don't take a saving of the support staff until the system is up and running. Because I think this has been shown to be really quite severe in this case, that the number of support calls necessary are doubled, yet the number of support staff had gone down because we'd assumed that we were taking a saving on where that was going to be, and we're still only at a level playing field now with what was in the past, and yet we don't have as much support as we used to have. So I think that's a recommendation I'd like to make. I think
Can you brief succinctly
as much as we can to say I don't. The council should not take savings of support staff until we're confident that a system has been installed and is working correctly.
I mean, that's sort of it's very relevant to this, but can be applied in a number of ways. Which touches on another recommendation I did have, which was, can we ask CSMC to look at something, which is digital inclusion and how we account for and support non-digital residents with any implementation of new systems. Would any members have any objections to that?
No, I like that. Just
because we come across this a lot in planning now. People want to view planning documents and they're not online. It's an absolute nightmare, especially on something like York Central. Anyway, so that's one for CSMC. We've got a big list coming here now. And I think the outstanding one was from Councillor Kilbane, which was, I think it would be incorrect to say to reintroduce paper visitor permits because we know they already exist and they're being given out, dare I say, on the quiet. If that is going on, then I think we're missing a real opportunity there to deliver a quick fix while this imperfect system is improved over time. I would happily support that recommendation if, you know, but I'm open to views. Are there any strong objections to that? Okay. And we'll make that to the executive member for transport.
I think there's an element to this that is probably not directed to the executive member, but to the officers to investigate what's going on in Sheffield if they are operating a paper system for some visitors. How is that working? Could we just not adopt that rather than just go back to our scratch card system? Would it be a better system? Would it be a worse system? I don't know.
Any comments, views on that? Yeah, happy to support that too. I know we've got quite a lot here, but I think this is worthwhile. Officers, I am genuinely grateful for your time tonight. I know it's not been straightforward. I genuinely also think it's been very healthy that we've had such a wide-ranging discussion. It is a problem on the doors, and there's too many problems within that collective problem to not give it the time that it's had tonight. So thank you to you both, and thank you to Councillor de Gorn also for fronting it up. Not everybody fronts these things up, so you have my respect for that. And I think that's all on that item. Thanks. Yeah, the final item then is looking at the work plan. I do have a couple of issues on this. Issues, they're not negatives. One was very briefly on the public realm. No, with the EV charging item that we've got lined up for January. The chair of Climate Scrutiny Committee, Councillor Christian Vassie, has expressed an interest in their committee members being invited to ours to take part in that item. I think it's a good idea. It worked well when we joined housing on that item dealing with short-term lets. So is people cool with that?
I'm cool with that. I'd just like to add, Chair, I've been approached by a PhD student at the University of York who's doing his PhD, I guess, on EV charging, and would like to offer his expertise and thoughts to the council. So perhaps we could invite him along.
Good idea. Yeah. Can you send me a quick email on that?
Sure.
Thank you. Cheers, Councillor Dave Taylor. Or Dave. God, it's been a long night. And then, of course, we had the representation from the public speaker, which was, here's where my paraphrasing falls apart, which was to bring this report that's gone on to do with pavement cafe licensing. So there's a report with executive at the minute that's now publicly available. The speaker requested that we have a proper look at that ourselves. I'm cool with that. James, sorry.
Well, I'm just going to help you on a couple of items, really. So the report recommends that the pavement cafe licensing rules is added to the list of things that licensing committee control the policy on. So it would become something that licensing committee within their purview. It's not at the moment, but the proposal is that it would become something within their purview. Now, I'm not trying to say you should or you shouldn't. I'm just trying to make sure you're up to speed. I'm not trying to steer one way or the other. And in a similar vein, some of the other things that are on your forward plan, but just to be aware of what else is on the forward plan. So the bus service improvement update, there is a report that's been deferred to December's exec on the bus industry because of the number of notices we're getting about changes to bus service from operators. So in terms of your timing in January, it would just been to executive in December the 15th, I think it is, from memory. So just to be aware that this is on the forward plan as well, just so you can work out your timing.
Yeah.
And in a similar vein, the weeds pilot is on the forward plan to go to the environment and climate change decision session on the 14th of December. So just in terms of other things that are happening and other decisions that are coming, I just thought it'd be helpful and for transparency to make you aware these decisions are coming before the January one. And I'm presuming the March one you've got is the Civic Trust presenting to you their piece of work, not us doing it.
Yeah, but we'll find other things for you to.
Oh, I'm sure you will. I'm sure you'll keep me busy.
No, that's helpful enough, James. Thank you. I mean, I guess I think what would be helpful to ask committee members is, are we comfortable with taking the speaker suggestion? And if we can get it into January, pending how those other two items, BSIP and weed pilot go, we can judge how much space we're going to have in January, and failing that, we could do March, which is very open at the moment. I would like us to look at it. I've got Councillor Pearson and Kilbane.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I was just thinking it's quite I think we've managed to spend 2.5 hours on one agenda item tonight. So I'm just wondering if January's looking a bit busy, and I just wanted to double check what you'd said about climate change committee, because I'm also thinking, would it be worth shuffling the items around if it meant that the climate change members could depart after one or two items, if you know what I mean? It's just some thoughts.
I see what you mean. I mean, we probably put EV charging first on the agenda, and then if they wanted to go after then, they could. And yeah, I mean, we can have a look also at setting up a commission slot to maybe specifically deal with EV charging and public realm. Can we do that 2 in 1? Is that allowed? It's not disallowed. That works a lot in this council, doesn't it? Okay, well, look, we can look into that, and that might streamline things a bit more early next year.
Chair, should we leave the payment cafes issue to licensing? I'm conscious that we don't end up duplicating work.
I hear you, Councillor Taylor. I'm not. My worry would be if it's left to licensing, it'll fall into a quite black and white discussion about what's legal and what isn't, rather than what could we be doing better. I mean, you get in this committee, for better or worse, we can get a bit more involved in stuff. In my view, that's one of the benefits of scrutiny. Happy to liaise with colleagues on exactly what that report looks like that comes to us.
I think that's better than you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Dave. Councillor Kilbane, that is a hand? Yeah.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, I mean, I think we could pencil it in for March for sure, because I think what we need to do is look at it in the round. So, you know, how is it working across the whole of the city in terms of access to the city and cafe licensing? Licensing will have, of course, their own role to play once if it becomes their purview as to whether or not to grant licenses. But, you know, we do have a general role as to how this is working across the piece. And it might sit, that big city centre piece might sit with street charters, and it might sit with courier access as well. I don't know, but we'd have to have a think about that. But yeah, I'd certainly be keen to have a look at how it's working a few years on.
Yeah.
Just to clarify, it won't be licensing committee that determine those applications. The way the legislation is written, there's only 15 days from the business advertising it to making a decision. So it will still be officers that determine the applications as now. The recommendation in the report is that licensing committee take ownership of the policy. So in future, policy changes to the pavement cafe licenses would be made by licensing committee. The way the current national legislation is written, we've only got 7 days as a council to actually make a decision. So we're not going to we'll have licensing committees once a week. It's the way the current legislation is written, that's just not going to happen. But the policy, as I say, it's only a recommendation to exec, so it might change. Just to be clear, it's only a officer recommendation to executive at this stage. It hasn't been determined. That's next Tuesday. But just to flag just so there's clarity, that's all I wanted to make sure.
Thank you, James.
Chair, sorry, I just wanted to clarify what you were doing with the EV charging one. Were you separating that out with weeds and doing it separate to January?
Remains to be seen. So what we're going to try and do, if possible, is do a commission slot joint with climate, which will contain the EV item and the public realm update. That would essentially create a new meeting.
Yeah, I
And
was
if we can't, forgive me,
sorry.
we'll keep it in January.
All I was going to propose is we just extend the scope of that EV charging thing to do an overarching that includes on-street charging, because it's just that's quite a narrow subject, which we've sort of to a degree got quite a firm policy position on, and there's not an awful. What might be useful if we do it in the round in terms of EV charging, and then focus during that meeting on the particular issue of or pull out the issue of why we do or don't do on-street charging.
Okay,
I'm just preempting a discussion we might have.
It's helpful. Councillor Dave Taylor.
Yeah, Dave, I brought this to committee a while ago on the basis that policy on EV charging is basically around hubs. And lots of people are complaining that they live in terrace streets, so they live in platted areas, and hubs are not the solution for them. And they want a solution. They want the council to be looking at and having a policy for a solution that allows them to charge their car on their street. And the technologies are changing, and there's a myriad of them. So that was my suggestion.
No,
that we look at that in more
understood.
detail.
Understood. Just a point of clarity, we do allow on-street charging. We do. We have installed on-street charging in new areas, but it's very, very difficult to achieve it on terrace streets, for example. But I'm happy for that to play out, Chair, as you see fit. But I understood.
I appreciate it's difficult, and I think that's why we need to look at it in a bit more detail, and looking at new technologies, and perhaps get this student who's got some additional knowledge to advise us as well.
Does he have to do an internship, this lad?
Who knows?
But look, I mean, I should say, in advance of that, given previous issues, avoidable or unavoidable, with what's gone into certain reports and by when, we can pick this up pre-Christmas in good time, so we get exactly what we want out of it. Is that all right, everyone? Any urgent business? I don't think there is. Thank you, everyone, for your time, and to the public speaker who has made it to the very end. It's much appreciated, and to the staff who've worked late supporting the meeting too. Thanks all.